Mark Carney, trouble looms or may already have arrived. I'm going to tell Jen why I think the PM is in trouble. We're going to talk about what's coming up next on the Prime Minister's agenda, including the King coming to town. Also, don't celebrate murder.
This episode of the Lime Podcast is brought to you by Unsmoke Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadians who are looking to quit smoking understand the full range of options available. Despite decades of government programs and increasing regulations, today, nearly 4 million Canadians still smoke cigarettes. Adult smokers who choose to continue to smoke should be aware that other options exist. While not risk-free, alternatives such as heated tobacco, vaping products, and oral smokeless products provide a potentially less harmful choice. Smoke-free alternatives do not involve combustion or burning, like smoking a cigarette does. Instead of heavily restricting access and information about these options, Canada's government should be adopting common-sense legislation that will help further bring down Canada's smoking rates and put information in the hands of Canadians. Information such as the relative risks compared to cigarettes. Because the products are not the same, and they shouldn't be treated the same. It's just common sense. Learn more about how a smoke-free future can be achieved at Unsmoke.ca.
I don't know. Jen said, first of all, hi, everybody.
Hi, we're back. We're back again.
What day is it? Recording this May 23rd.
May 23rd.
Jen said to me a couple of days ago, I think we all need a vacation. And I was like, no, I feel great. What are you talking about? And then I find myself leading into the intro, just shouting into the camera. So maybe I do need a vacation.
With a controversial and bold statement about being against murder. No murder.
We'll
murder
get to
bad.
it.
Yeah, we'll get to it.
Segment 3.
Segment 3. Okay, so we are going to talk about the tyranny of Mark Carney.
I shouldn't laugh, but it just gives you a bit of a sense of how fucked the world is that we're like, and we'll condemn murder coming up in segment 3.
Right. No, but I think that one of the great things about being a journalist is that there's really no way to be a journalist without developing a really dark sense of humor. Like just like awful. Like the things we joke about off air, the things we joke about on air are already pretty awful. But the things we joke about off air, let me tell you, so much worse. When we had to hire someone to help us with our sort of HR and invoicing and things like that, we had to warn her right off the front. It was like, you will be exposed to things in this job, and we can't help you with that. We can't prevent the trauma that we will cause you. But we're really nice people. And
I have had
to work for.
I've had to have conversations about like which picture of the blown up bombing victims is not graphic enough that we can run, or like what's the more interesting local story, like beauty pageant winner also achieves 4.0 GPA, or 7 killed in overnight apartment fire due to faulty smoke detector. There's no way to do this job without eventually turning weird.
Oh yeah, no, it happens. And eventually, if you listen to us long enough, you'll be
weird too.
You'll be weird too. You'll be right along for that ride. All right. So look, I want to talk about the tyranny of Mark Carney.
Tyranny of Mark Carney.
This week, Mark Carney issued a mandate letter. And no mandate letters, as far as I can tell, have gone out to, at least no public ones, have gone out to the actual ministers. Instead, we have one centralized mandate letter with Mark Carney. A lot of the political science nerds are very upset about it. I am not. I like the mandate letter. I think that it sets out a pretty clear set of priorities that were derived directly from the election that we just had. There was nothing in there that surprised me, and everything that he put in the mandate letter, especially around building fast, building pipelines, well, I don't think pipelines were specifically mentioned, but it was Canada as an energy and conventional superpower, all that kind of stuff was a distillation of the best parts of why I think the Canada elected Mark Carney. So if he can actually execute on that mandate letter, I think that we will have for the most part, more or less happy, country. I mean, there will always be malcontents, but that's just what it is. We will probably be the malcontents. The question isn't whether or not Carney has a pretty good outlook and vision for the problems of what needs to be done. I think the question is, can he actually execute given whom he has surrounded himself with? And to that note, I mean, we also had another little bit of news that his interim chief of staff, Mendicino, will be staying as his chief of staff because apparently he can't find a replacement. It looks like Carney can't find anyone to take up that role, which, to be totally fair, is a shit role. It's a terrible job. So poor Marco Mendicino may literally be chained to the desk indefinitely and be forced to manage a recalcitrant Liberal caucus instead of
for his sins.
For his sins, yes. Yeah, that is how he will be punished.
No sympathy for him on that front.
Right. I mean, we may go into why we are not fans of Marco Mendicino here at the line. But look, I mean, is it not an appropriate penance? I don't know. Maybe it is.
You know what? I mean, one of the most vicious burns I ever laid on someone is may all your dreams come true. Like sometimes people want what's going to destroy them. And as the spiteful, bitter person I am, all I can wish them is success, because what they're aspired to will be their ruination.
I mean, the same is almost inevitably going to be true for ourselves. We will fly too close to the sun and die. It's fine. Yeah.
Yep. The question is whether or not we care by the time it happens. So what was really interesting, actually, was just before we got rolling, like literally moments before we started rolling here, where like we'd agreed on the podcast segments 1, 2, 3, what we're going to talk about. But then you said you were going to talk about in segment 1, the good news for Carney. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. Rare example of Jen and I not being simpatico. Because I think what I'm seeing from Carney so far is bad. And I don't mean that as performance review. I mean that more as starting to go, there's something very familiar about all this. But, you know, because we don't often put our best foot forward, why don't you make the case for why you think Carney is not having a terrible start? Or, I'll get rid of the double negative. He's having a good start.
Okay, so I think his first week last week was a bit of a disaster, where a lot of his more unhinged cabinet minister basically went off message, and this sent a really bad early sign about how he was managing his cabinet. But this week we have a story coming out from, I believe, Nardi from the National Post, basically explaining that, like, Mark Carney's a hard ass. Like, he's coming down in his cabinet. He's like accepting no lates. Like, you got to show up to the office on time wearing business professional attire. Like, you can't be effing around on your briefs. Like, he expects that you're going to know your stuff. And also hearing rumors from within the Liberal caucus themselves that these guys are going to be expected to step up and perform appropriately, or they're going to get shuffled out. And essentially I can't judge him on governance because it's too soon for that. But that strikes me as the appropriate tone for the leader of a government to be setting. He's not going to tolerate, senior members of government faffing about working from home in their pajamas. No, you want to run a government where I'm expecting you to show up and be here on time. And to me,
that's our job. Staying at home in our pajamas. That's what we do, damn it.
But it is what we do, goddammit. And there's a reason why we're not in government. There's a reason why we're like popcorning from the side, judging what's happening in government and not actually holding real power because we don't want it. But to me, that is setting an appropriate tone, and it's a real contrast from the Trudeau government, where there did seem like there was a considerable lack of cohesion and discipline in terms of how cabinet was managed. And this was made up for by over-centralization in the chief of staff. Telford's, sorry, I'm having a brain fart. Help me, save me. Drowning.
Katie Telford.
Drowning.
Katie
Thank
Telford,
you. Thank
former
you.
Chief of Staff for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
All of the files started to pile up on her desk in this really overly centralized way, and stuff got dropped, and files and agendas got started to get collapsed. God, I'm struggling. My God, I'm going to have a sip of coffee and let you come into the conversation on that note.
Sometimes in hockey games, you'll see a goalie skate over to the bench and squeeze an energy gel into his mouth, particularly when he's had a lot of shots.
Yep.
Could someone get Jen an energy gel here? And you're 2 hours earlier than me. You have no excuse.
None at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the thing. I can definitely take over, but I feel like we're going to abort your attempt to give the good version of this if I do.
Okay. All right. No, that's fine. We can abort. Our audience loves it when we abort that.
Rolling in guns hot.
And the fetus.
So I think what you were saying a minute ago is correct. And the first thing I've noticed, and I've noticed this on a couple of fronts, and I've been talking to my own sources, and then as you mentioned, Chris Nardi, National Post, as I affectionately call my former intern, Nards. Nards wrote this great piece in the Post. And I first of all, I always happy to read what he's writing. He's one of the best. Second, I particularly enjoyed reading this one because it was outside confirmation of what I was also hearing. And that's kind of like always a good feeling of, okay, good, I haven't been led down the garden path. Carney's come in. He's setting some high standards. Some of them are dumb. Insisting on British spelling in official documents, I think, is stupid. You know, like, yeah, I can't wait to hear the Prime Minister get up and tell Canadians he understands they're concerned about the cost of petrol. I think it's stupid. Let people write their documents and whatever. I think that's dumb. But he has apparently set deadlines. Like, you will be on time. We will move quickly. We will set goals and we will deliver on them. I think this is good. I think this is a necessary corrective to Justin Trudeau. I think it's encouraging that Mark Carney has correctly identified what went wrong with Justin Trudeau. I just don't think he can do it. And I feel like I'm repeating myself week after week here, but this goes all the way back to that column I wrote just before the election. I just don't buy the theory that the only thing that Canada was missing the last 10 years was Mark Carney. That, like, by force of will, he's going to step in and take a 350,000 person civil service and probably like 700 million McKinsey consultants by now. And just by the sheer power of his Mark Carneyness is going to push things to a higher gear. I just don't buy it. And reading what Nards was writing, combined with some of the conversations I've been having with people, Carney's going to run into three problems here. First, the government itself. It's a broken machine, or at the very least, it's a very slow and rickety machine. Two, the Liberal caucus. They're already grumbling. Not a lot, but a little. And I think that's really interesting. But first, number one problem for Mark Carney, he doesn't know what he's doing yet. And he hasn't brought his own people. And that's something we wrote in our dispatch on Victoria Day. Marco Mendicino, whatever you'll say about the guy, he knows government. He's been around. Apparently he doesn't check his email, so he probably should know more about government. But he's not sticking around permanently. My understanding is some of the key Trudeau era people who sort of whipped together the Carney campaign and came in with him, they're not planning on sticking around. Some of them, I'm given to understand, have left already. We made this point on Monday. Where are the Carney people? Why does he not have a trusted personal lieutenant who's going to be at his side? I'm sorry, he prefers Britishisms, lieutenant. Why does he not have a trusted personal lieutenant who's there to watch his back, but also to go, yeah, you know what, Mark, you don't really know what you're doing here. Don't stop proofreading the documents. That's not your job. Well, you've got to focus on other things.
And the other thing I would say is one of the alarming little bits of information that came up in the Nards piece was that Carney seems to have a habit toward micromanaging. He's spending too much time and too much bandwidth on stuff that he should be delegating, which indicates two things to me. And that is, firstly, someone who can't delegate is someone who either has internal control issues that they need to get under control themselves, or it's someone who doesn't trust the people around them, right? If you can't delegate, that indicates that you are working with people or your underlings are untrustworthy or not competent or haven't proven their competence to you. And if that's the case, which I suspect it is, in Carney's situation, then you need to bring outsiders in whom you do trust, because, you know, as a prime minister, as I can personally attest, no, I can't, obviously, but like, you only have so many hours in a day, and you cannot. This was one of the major critiques I had of Pierre, and when he actually ran his campaign, but also the way that his campaign indicated the flaws in how he would govern things, was not bringing in a wide team of people, was not appointing a transition team, seemed to be operating under the assumption that you could run a G7 country and its attendant economy inside of the brilliance of your own brain. And you can't. you can't govern that you can't govern that way. I mean, Trudeau tried to govern that way a little bit, and Telford tried to govern that way, and it was disastrous. You need to have a handful at a minimum, probably more like a dozen of people whom you trust to execute, who are going to handle things. And you can go to them and say, look, you need to handle this. You need to figure out how you handle this. Ideally, that's what a cabinet's supposed to be about. That's what cabinet ministers are supposed to be about. Yeah, like
you should have a designated person in charge of certain silos of public policy within a government.
Yes.
And they should also have their own staffs.
Yes, exactly. And like, that's how these systems are supposed to work. And it's not supposed to be centralized through, Mark Carney's brain or Justin Trudeau's brain or Katie Telford's brain or Marco Mendicino's brain. It has to be delegated. And if this government cannot appoint people who are competent enough to handle files, we're done. We're toast. So, yes, that is where I would agree that there are some alarming signs. Or we can say the other possibility is that this reflects something that is an intrinsic control issue that, how should I say this? People's greatest strengths are often their greatest weaknesses. So if Mark Carney succeeded through his career by, superhuman internal control, superhuman discipline, and a superhuman work ethic, that's great right up until the moment when you can't scale yourself up anymore. And then how do you cede control over your environment to people you trust? That might be an internal personal flaw he has.
It's funny too, because this is a Mark Carney-fied version of what we were saying about Pierre Poilievre the last 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
Poilievre was good at what he did. It brought him right to the cusp, but it couldn't get him over it.
Couldn't get him over it.
And he needed everything that he was and everything that he had done, plus a little bit, and couldn't do it. So one of the things I don't know, and I've been asking, and I still don't have this answer, is whether the staffing problems Carney is apparently running into are because he's too picky or because no one wants the job. And I honestly don't know, and we're not going to determine that on our podcast here, although I suspect, having now mentioned it, Beetlejuice style, liberals will be DMing me to tell me which one their theory is. It's funny. I was thinking this morning, thinking the deep thoughts this morning. One of the things I did not expect to happen was that I would become, in my own way, a defender of Justin Trudeau. But I am.
Oh, no.
Yep. And it's in a very specific way. I think the Liberals, Mark Carney, cabinet, caucus, etc., I think they're going to get themselves in trouble if they believe the lie that it was all Justin's fault, that there was something wrong with him as a person, that he was lazy or dumb or ill-intended, and that bad things happened to this country because he either wanted them to, couldn't stop them, or couldn't be asked to stop them. And I think that's wrong. I think Trudeau got overwhelmed by events and may not have ever even realized it. I think life got overwhelmed him. I don't even mean personal stuff. I just mean the job, like crisis after crisis after crisis. And I don't think he ever really was able to get the government rolling again after that. But I don't think that was a Justin Trudeau limited problem. I think that's a government of Canada writ large problem. And if Mark Carney and others think that Mark Carney subbing in fixes it, it might help. I mean, I think at the very least it won't hurt. I think it was necessary. But I'm just not buying the theory that the problem was contained within the corporeal, physical being of Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, there's a deeper malaise happening that needs to be addressed. The other thing I would just say is we're talking about, well, why hasn't Mark Carney brought trusted lieutenants in from his very illustrious career? And isn't one of the reasons why Canada elected this guy because of his resume? And isn't one of the unstated benefits of that resume supposed to be this incredible Rolodex of incredible talent from around the world that he can bring in to help manage this mess of a government? There is one person whom he did effectively bring in, and that's Tim Hodgson. So he is now the energy minister. Hodgson was in Calgary this morning and yesterday talking to oil sector. He did a breakfast at the Chamber of Commerce, which I probably should have tried to finagle into. But my understanding is that, like, literally it was impossible to get into this breakfast. It was just like black market ticket style. Like Alex tried to get in and like couldn't get in. You know, like
guys wandering around the lobby going, you need a ticket. You need a ticket
to the Chamber of Calgary's Chamber of Commerce breakfast.
Who's buying?
Like, who's buying? Like literally, right? So you know, lots of people who were there. I probably should have tried to get in on a media ticket, but I didn't because it was really early and I'm bad. Anyway, and we were filming this podcast. Well, we were filming this podcast for split times. Anyway, but look, my understanding from people who were there this morning and people who were talked to Hodgson last night, Thursday night, was so far he's making the correct mouth noises. There is an acknowledgement that the relationship between the previous federal government and the energy sector went awry. There's an understanding of a need for a reset, and interestingly, there seems to be an understanding that from Hodgson that. You know, we know you guys want to build a big project to make yourselves look great and look big, but like, we don't exist for your benefit. The energy sector doesn't exist for your benefit. Like, there has to be a rational economic argument for the stuff you're trying to build here. Along with paired with an understanding that part of what makes a rational economic benefit is a process that is rational, an approvals process that is rational, right? So, you know, the early reviews that I've heard back from these conversations has been positive. Like, there is an attempt to reach out, bring the temperature down, bring the business community on board, and create a reset with the oil and gas sector. And the oil and gas sector, we know, was pretty tangential to Alberta writ large. But again, can he execute? I mean, the problems aren't just Justin Trudeau. The problems with sort of getting approvals processes, not even fast-tracked, but just rationally tracked through this country for the last 15 years has also come down to broader conversations around the need to develop social license, which is an impossible metric to meet because nobody can define in objective terms what social license means or how. It's
whatever the politicians who are afraid of decide it means.
That's correct. That's exactly right. But that means that, like, if one person out of 1,000 on a pipeline's route says, I object to this, then
you need a politician with the garumba to deal with a 0.1% dissent rate.
That's exactly right. And if you don't have a politician willing to do that, then social license means effectively veto power to that 0.01% dissent rate. So essentially, this is the broader social context in which this is happening. Is that they tried to get like an ephemeral concept like social license kind of codified into our approvals process, which had the effect of saying nothing can get built anymore, and everything. And not only will nothing get built, but you will spend billions of dollars in 15 years chasing an approvals process that can change at any moment because the next set of politicians will come in with a whole different set of standards. And at the same time, probably nothing will get built because at the end of the day, you need social license to build this project. And social license isn't the same thing as a rational objective approvals process that meets metrics, right? You can't propose a project of any kind, whether or not we're talking about something controversial or not, around metrics that can't be objectively codified. So this has been a long-standing problem, and the previous federal government made this worse by humoring it, essentially. Previous provincial governments, I'm looking at you, BC, have made this worse by trying to usurp the authority of the federal government on interprovincial projects. The federal government has made this worse.
Somewhere, Christy Clark is still finding a way to get to the yes.
Yeah, right. With the 5 approvals process that are not like.
Yep.
you can't.
Still working so hard, just the same way that
so
OJ spent every day of his life trying to find the real killers.
Well, exactly, right? I mean,
Yeah.
The federal government needs to have authority over the things the federal government has authority on. And that means the federal government needs to be able to go to Alberta, BC, and Quebec and Ontario and say, we've put this process through a rigorous review.
Yeah.
We have approved it, and now it's getting built.
First of all,
and this is not your jurisdiction. It's not your problem.
I think that might have been history's first ever O.J. Simpson, Christy Clark comparison. So I just wanted to underline that. I wrote years ago that what you have to, I'm trying to remember where the hell I wrote this. I think maybe it was TVO. Like I might have been writing about an Ontario specific thing, but what you have to understand is that an enormous percentage of our bureaucracy and also I would say our processes in government are currently designed not to accomplish a goal, but to give the politician cover to accomplish the goal. So it's like reams of money, time, staffing, attention, years go into, okay, here's what we want to do. Here's what the public wants. A majority of it, maybe not like a massive majority, but like a big chunk of the public, or maybe here is just something that is in the national or provincial interest to do. But we're going to get yelled at. So we're going to just burn millions of dollars, years of time, just trillions of calories of political energy to create all these processes around us that are our heat shields from the criticism we'll get. And you could actually just get rid of all of it if you had a politician with Garumba. If they just basically went, it's in the public interest. If we campaigned on it, or we didn't, but we're the fucking government, or we just got to get it done. So obviously, I'm not trying to downplay consultation. Obviously, there are projects where you need to get Indigenous communities involved. There are environmental things that need to happen.
There are legal requirements on this sort of stuff now.
But when it's done
in law,
you either do it, or if you're a Canadian politician, you go, we'd better have another round because someone in cabinet thinks they're going to get creamed at the next all candidates meeting or some bullshit. So all of a sudden you have a new blue ribbon task force that's been stood up to reanalyze the issue here. And what I don't know, and you've written about this, you've called it kind of the octopus economy, and you haven't explicitly identified this part of it. So this is one of the tentacles of the octopus economy. There is now an entire industry that sustains the processes.
Yes, the purpose of the thing is what it does. So now the purpose of the thing is to engage in the process.
Yeah.
Perpetually. It's not about building things. It's about engaging in the process perpetually. It's a perpetual taxpayer funded process machine.
I remember talking to a woman once who was telling me what her job was, and basically it was mediating infrastructure development projects among a broad spectrum of stakeholders. And I said to her, and I'm like, okay, so she was retiring early. She had a cottage. She had a house in a nice part of the city, nice car. And so she was obviously very, very successful. She had a whole company. She had people working for her. And I remember saying to her at one point, just out of curiosity, like, what percentage of the projects that you've been involved in mediating have actually been built? She just laughed.
There you go. And that's the answer, right? I mean, even when we talk about Indigenous consultation, there is now a legal requirement held up, I believe, by the Supreme Court that Indigenous people have to be consulted about stuff that passes through their land.
Rightly so.
Sure. And I actually think there's a moral responsibility that we have that Indigenous people who are affected or have standing on specific projects receive a significant and fair compensation or economic involvement in those projects. I think that's uncontroversial, even among, especially among oil and gas in this country. There's an understanding that you can't just bulldoze a pipeline through traditional treaty lands and all the benefits are going to go to the white person. We don't operate a country like that anymore. And it's good that we don't operate a country like that anymore. However, the flip side of that is consultation doesn't mean veto. And it can't mean veto. And the reason why it can't mean veto is that, especially when we're talking about going through BC, there's a whole bunch of unceded territory. Not all land has been, like building pipeline infrastructure in Alberta is a relatively comparatively simple process because a lot of the treaty lands have been long settled, right? There's not a lot of controversy about which tribe has rights or access to particular lands. That's not true in BC. BC is basically a giant stew of unceded territory where lots of different tribes and lots of different organizations and lots of different kind of family groups and lots of different kinds of governments can claim that they have standing over certain amounts of territory. So if your concept of Indigenous consultation basically means Indigenous veto, nothing gets built. You can't build a goddamn road in BC if that's the standard by which these projects are being held to. It's not an attainable standard in any human system because humans are humans. So it's a really, really interesting problem, and it's a really difficult problem to mediate and deal with. I mean, I think honestly, one of the ways that we need to, that's why the energy corridor stuff is really compelling, because it suggests that this is a one-time negotiation of a one-time corridor. And once that corridor is agreed, it's there in perpetuity, and we're not constantly caught in these legal battles over these issues again and again and again. But honestly, in the long term, the only way you need to resolve these issues is you need to get these unceded territory claims sorted. We need to do.
Is that all?
Well, exactly, right?
Excellent.
But I mean, these are generational projects, and you can't necessarily, like, some of these unceded territory claims are going to take generations to resolve at the current pace of resolution that we're dealing with. And in the meantime, what, are we just not going to build anything? The answer is we can't function as a country that way.
The answer probably is, in fact, that is exactly how we're going to do it.
Well, then we're not going to function as a country.
We're not functioning as a country.
We're not functioning as a country. And that's where this stuff falls apart. So are we going to see a Mark Carney that has the political capital and the garumba to come forth and say, I'm going to make unpopular decisions and I'm willing to expend political capital on unpopular decisions? That's the crux of all of this.
You know what? It's okay. Marco Mendicino's got this.
Cool.
Okay. So that was us setting up some of looking a little bit in the rearview mirror of issues that Mark Carney's already grappling with. I want to talk, when we come back, we're going to make a pivot here. We're still going to talk federal politics, but we're going to make a pivot to what's coming up, because it's going to be a busy week. And even kind of after the week to come, we got a lot more stuff coming up and around. So stick around. We're going to tell you the kind of week it's going to be in Ottawa. We're going to do that next. This is the Line Podcast. Go to readtheline.ca, check out our website, sign up even for a free account there. Paid accounts are better, but a free one will get you almost everything we publish. You'll get it in your inbox every morning. We publish great written content 5 or 6 days a week, so check us out there. We're back in a moment. This is the Line Podcast. Stay tuned. This episode of the Line Podcast is also brought to you by Innovative Medicines Canada. With a new government in place, one thing remains clear. Canada must continue to prioritize patients and healthcare innovation. Innovative Medicines Canada is focused on collaborating with all levels of government to improve access to life-saving medicines and develop a healthcare system that prioritizes patients, ignites innovation, and drives economic growth. Canada's innovative medicines sector plays a critical role, not just in health outcomes, but in keeping us competitive on the global stage. That's why, even during a moment of political change, Innovative Medicines Canada is staying focused on the issues that matter most to Canadians. And as Canada moves forward with national pharmacare, Innovative Medicines Canada believes it's possible to expand access without limiting choice by strengthening what works and fixing what doesn't. Visit innovativemedicines.ca to learn more. We spent the first segment talking about more rearward looking stuff. I mean, Jen did gaze generations into the future on, all the Indigenous land in BC. But in general, we were talking about the kind of weeks Carney has been having and why, we wrote this in our dispatch on Monday, like in the next couple of months, either Mark Carney is going to assimilate the Liberal Party or the Liberal Party is going to assimilate Mark Carney. And I'm not liking the signs so far. I am very concerned, but we'll let the future unfold in its own good time. let's talk a little bit about what's coming up immediately. And we got the King coming to town next week, which is cool.
King's coming to town.
I think I'm going to be there. I don't think I was able to get in, but I think I'll be in Ottawa when the King's there, and that ain't nothing. What's amazing to me, though, and this is kind of, we joked in the first segment, it's like, and coming up in segment 3, murder. When the King's coming to town, I know it's weird to say that might not actually be the most interesting story, but I actually think the most interesting story on the government's plate right now is another Canada Post strike.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think this is actually going to be one of the first major crises / challenges to hit the Carney government, and how it responds to a Canada Post strike is going to tell us a lot. So I don't know if you guys remember already, but a couple months ago, this was prior to the last election, there was a Canada Post strike. Mm-hmm. It dragged on and on and on. And essentially the Trudeau government punted on it. They said, all right, we're just going to force you guys to put this off until May.
So it was like a 6-month
It was
truce.
A 6-month truce, essentially, is what
Which
they kind of forced on the government.
I think today.
Yeah, ended apparently today. But what I think was not unreported, but underreported was the degree to which especially small businesses in Canada were just getting creamed by this strike. Look, this is a clear conversation for back to work legislation. Unfortunately, the Canada Post, when it goes on strike, undermines its relevance. And makes an argument for its own obsolescence when it goes on strike.
Members of my own family, older, still in their prime, but older, who had always been paper invoice and check people, mm-hmm. switched in the last Canada Post strike, and now they're auto payment or debit payment. And it's just kind of one of those things where I've got to assume there's a million others just like them. And that's a million customers who are not popping 5 or 6 pieces of mail into a mailbox every month. We at the line, we slightly changed how we do business. There were a couple of things every month or two. Like, it wasn't often, but every month or two, I'd wander down to the mailbox near the library that's just in my neighborhood. I'd pop a couple of letters in the mail for you, and they'd go out to you in Calgary in a couple of days. I don't do that anymore. Maybe now if I actually need to physically send you something, I do it quarterly and I use FedEx.
Yeah. So, here's the question that I would have for Canada Post. Do we really need a Canada Post that is going on strike twice a year and completely disrupting the entire Canadian sort of infrastructure? Or are we better off just saying, FedEx, here, we're going to subsidize, you take over Canada Post's duties, and the government will pay you a fee of some kind to keep costs for small businesses down.
I think we talked about this last time. You in Calgary, you're doing community mailbox, right?
Yep. We're in community mailbox. Yep.
I'm not one of the older neighborhoods in Toronto. My neighborhood, just a little urban history or urban geography here. You can kind of tell when a neighborhood was built in Toronto based on where the cars are parked. If they're on the street because there's no driveways, they're late 19th or early 20th centuries. My neighborhood, we have driveways, but we don't typically have garages. The neighborhoods to the north of me, they have big driveways and garages. So my neighborhood is one of the ones where things are still a little compact. We don't really have room for community mailboxes, or I think that's kind of bullshit. That's always been the argument.
Community mailboxes don't take up that much space. It'll be ridiculous.
I think that's true, but that's always been the bullshit. But you know what we could easily do? I can settle getting my mail once a week. I don't need mail 5 days a week.
No, we don't need 5 day a week mail service anymore.
I just think it's nuts. And I'm not trying to pick on them, because you always feel bad for the workers who are affected by this. Jen and I are print media veterans. We know what being obsolete feels like. We get it. But Canada Post is not bargaining from a position of strength here. And I said to you, we almost touched on this in the first segment when we got to talk about process and procedure derailing progress. But I said to you before we started rolling, Canada is one big series of interconnected networks of hostage takings where we're all trying to hold each other hostage. What is Canada Post leverage here? Every time they do this, they're weakening their own position. I actually am unusually vulnerable to a Canada Post strike now, simply because, as I've been regaling our listeners with in recent weeks, I've got all these government documents coming in, and they're all coming in via Canada Post. I got some of them. I need one more. If I get that damn thing before the strike happens, I'm not going to need Canada Post again for months.
Well, the other thing I was saying, do you know what this strike reminds me of, or what these strikes remind me of? The Calgary Herald strike of 1999. So this is another classic example. This was before all newspapers totally fell off a cliff, but like the trend lines were looking bad.
You were like 12. Why were you paying attention?
Well, I mean, I later worked at the Calgary Herald, and I read about it and learned about the history of the paper. So like I wasn't a participant in the strike, obviously, because I was too young at that time.
Jen raced right back from piano lessons to get to the picket line.
To get to the picket line. But I think it was, it was one of the clearest, earliest examples, I think, of a strike failing. Mm. I can't remember exactly how long that strike lasted, but it lasted a very, very long time. And it was extremely acrimonious between the journalists and the workers and the owners. It was brutal strike, like really nasty, very nasty strike. People crossed picket lines. They hired outside of the unionized workforce to keep the paper running. Like, it was really mean. And, I knew people who would cross the picket lines and got jobs at the Calgary Herald during the strike, and they were treated like shit afterwards when everybody went back because, of course, they were scabs, right? And essentially, my understanding is that, like, the strikers didn't get what they wanted. They were out for a long time. It was brutal. It was nasty. And ultimately, the owners prevailed. The owners won because the owners had to. Because the owners could look at the long-term trend forecasts for what was going to happen to the Calgary Herald. And they knew that if they gave in to the workers' demands, that was just going to accelerate those trend forecasts. Like, it was going to severely damage the bottom line of the Herald, which at that time still was. In fact, I think it maintained its position as one of the most profitable papers in the Post Media Network for a really long time. Also, the Calgary Herald strikers ran into an extra problem, was that they unionized a lot later than many of the other Post Media papers. And as a result, even though it was one of the most profitable papers, the cuts would always come to the non-unionized workers first. In fact, I think that actually that strike may have, I'm talking out of my ass here. I think that strike may have actually broken the union. But it was a really, really classic example of,
we know some Herald veterans. We can ask.
We could ask, but essentially, I wasn't planning on talking about this today, but it just sort of came up as we were discussing this. But it's a really classic example of workers losing leverage in a strike scenario when you are dealing with an industry that is in broader decline. Because when the industry is in broader decline, no, they can't give you the 2% wage hikes that you actually deserve. They can't make the accommodations that you're making because their own backs are up against the brutalities of the efficiencies they have to work with. So they have to let the strike play out, and they have to break you. Like, it goes from being workers are united to leverage their power against evil owners to the owners don't have a choice but to break you because it's that or everybody dies together, right? Like, and when unions go on strike, they have to measure that and, play their game appropriately. And sometimes, it happens that the unions miscalculate. They miscalculate.
Yeah.
And I think that this is one of these cases where the unions are miscalculating. By going on strike here. They are actually putting the owners in a position where they have to win. And that just means you get a long, protracted strike where everyone loses.
Maybe. But here we get back to talking about Carney. He doesn't have to win.
Oh, no, he's in a peak position to use the leverage he has to basically force these people back to work. Absolutely.
100%. But also he can just give them a sweetheart deal and make the problem go away. Like, it's going to be a personality test for Carney. Does he want to make a fiscally irresponsible decision to make a problem go away? Or is he going to be the cold-hearted central banker and play hardball? I don't know. I'm honestly curious.
Well, and this is why it's going to be a really interesting test of his government. It's going to be, I'm really interested to see how this goes down. So that's something to watch. King Visit. Do we have anything more to say about King Visit? And we also want to talk about the Golden Dome program.
Golden Dome, yeah.
Golden Dome.
Golden Dome.
Matt, you're the military guy. Can you explain
like
Golden Dome?
It
does.
It sounds like a condom.
It does sound like a condom.
Okay, Golden Dome, in theory, would be a multi-layered system of defenses from the United States or North America, because Canada is talking about this, that would protect us from a range of different attack scenarios that could, and it's not a crazy idea. I am skeptical as ever of Trump's ability to get anything done, because he'll change his mind 6 or 7 times every press conference. But some listeners and viewers will remember, and others will have read about it, Star Wars back in the 80s, the Ronald Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative. The Strategic Defense Initiative was basically, we will have space-based weapons, ground-based weapons, radar, satellites, potentially even laser weapons, directed energy weapons, that would make the United States invulnerable, and its allies, in theory, from ballistic missile attack. Ballistic missile, I hate throwing all this terminology at people. This just matters for a moment, because we're going to talk about how it's different from Golden Dome. Ballistic missile is when you use a missile, you kick a warhead of some kind, usually nuclear, but it doesn't have to be, into space on a trajectory where it just has a ballistic flight path, meaning purely governed by physics. There's no engine on these warheads. They're not driving themselves around. And if you launch them into orbit on the correct trajectory, they land in a predictable place, for instance, on the White House lawn. So these kinds of missiles are really, really hard to shoot down because they move incredibly quickly. Once they're in orbit, they are moving tens of thousands of kilometers an hour, and they're tiny. Like, people think nuclear weapons are big. I'm looking over like my computer right now where we're filming this. Like, I've got a little stand over there where my PlayStation and my record player is. It's bigger than a nuclear warhead. In the 80s, the idea didn't work. We do have more sophisticated technology now. The U.S. does have a limited, very limited, and unreliable ballistic missile defense system. They test it on a semi-regular basis. It sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. Golden Dome, in theory, is going to be that, but you're also going to add in defenses against cruise missile attacks, drone attacks, short-range rocket attacks. This would not all be one system. But you might get to the point where, in theory, you have a ballistic missile defense system for all of North America, but then over key military sites, you might also have defenses for cruise missiles or drones. The drones, I actually think, is the interesting one, because drones, like, if you've been paying attention to this,
the New Jersey drones.
But also every couple of months, you'll see something out of a Chinese city at night where they're putting on like a drone display in the sky where it looks like dragons or dolphins or stuff. Anyone who knows anything about military theory looks at that and goes, uh-oh. That kind of a coordinated drone swarm can make very pretty light show, or it could knock out a fleet of warships at anchor. So I'm in favor of Canada and the United States integrating a kind of continental missile, drone, rocket defense system. Technologically, it's possible. It's going to be expensive as all fuck, and it's probably never going to...
How is this different from Iron Dome in Israel?
Okay, great question. Iron Dome, obviously, the name is based on that. Iron Dome is designed to use relatively cheap interceptor rockets to knock down relatively primitive weapons. Okay. So what is fired into Israel typically is on, and some of Israel's enemies do have increasingly sophisticated weapons, but in general, Iron Dome is not dealing with threats like, well, in fact, I'm going to rephrase that. Iron Dome does not deal with ballistic missile threats. Okay. Iron Dome deals with a rocket some guy fired out of a pickup truck somewhere in Gaza.
And this is also why the Israelis are so deeply concerned about the nuclear program in Iran, because they don't have nobody has the ability to shoot down a ballistic missile.
The Israelis are okay at it. They've got things like David Sling. They've got the Arrow missile. The Houthis have been hurling ballistic missiles at Israel for a while. The Iranians hurled a bunch at them, and Israel did shoot some of them down. what the Israelis do with Iron Dome, and I wonder if Golden Dome would do something similar. The Israelis have basically mapped all of Israel, and they update the maps regularly, and they've broken the whole country down into very small plots of land, and they're each assigned like a computer designation. And then the Iron Dome system obviously needs to be updated regularly, has basically been programmed when there's incoming fire to plot where it's going to land. And the majority of the time, it will go, there's nothing valuable there. We're going to ignore it. It's not worth the cost of firing a missile to knock this thing down, because it's going to go land in a patch of farm, or it's going to hit some desert. But there are also plots of land that are identified as, no, there is something of value here. And that's when the Iron Dome system will engage it. So I don't know if Golden Dome would operate similarly. I would say probably.
Well, it'd have to, because you're dealing with a landmass that's just so much radically larger.
Yeah. I mean, the difference, of course, is if someone's setting nukes off in the middle of the Midwest, it's only going to kill a few hundred farmers directly, but it's still going to ruin a whole lot of our days.
Right.
So I don't think the idea is terrible. It's technically feasible-ish. The system ain't going to be perfect, but it's probably better than nothing. My immediate concerns are technological capacity. What we're talking about is at the outer limits, particularly with ballistic missiles, but it's feasible. Cost. The U.S. is already getting killed on the bond market for its deficit spending. It just got downgraded. I don't know if now is a great time to announce another Star Wars, meaning defense system, not a movie. Apparently you can announce the movies indefinitely and they'll keep making money. The other concern I have, and it's obvious I've mentioned already, Trump. Is he just going to, in 3 months, decide it must be a much bigger system than a much smaller? He's very unpredictable.
Right.
The fun one for our perspective, are elbows up or down if we're joining Golden Dome?
Was the second question I was going to ask. I mean, we're going to talk about one of the things we were even discussing a couple of months ago is we now have a president who's making direct threats to our sovereignty. Should we be integrated by NORAD? Should we be maybe pulling back in terms of our military integration? Why are we engaging in a program at this point that's integrates us even more heavily into North American defense and makes us more dependent on American defense systems?
That's a good question.
I mean, it's not to say that I would turn down the opportunity to have Americans shoot down a ballistic missile in the heart of Calgary or something. I mean, thank you. I would like that.
You'd want them to shoot it down before it got to the heart of Calgary, but yes.
That's right. I would want them to shoot it down farther away from where I live. So yes, I'm all for it. But the geopolitics of this are really weird.
Uh-huh.
I mean, is America a threat now or isn't it?
I would enjoy someone telling me that. Okay. Now, if I'm being really cynical, I can make an argument for why we should do it. We should insist on hosting several critical sensor and radar sites on Canadian territory, and then make sure there's always a crusty Canadian non-com nearby with a really big pair of hedge clippers. And if the Americans do anything stupid, he just goes out and cuts all the data links. So there is a way to make this a point of Canadian leverage as opposed to Canadian subservience. But I think we're getting into a pretty fundamental issue here. Now, let me give you and the listeners and viewers, and by the way, you're welcome. I want to give you a 1 minute worth of history lesson here. Because the Americans have been talking about ballistic missile defense, a more limited program than Golden Dome. They've been talking about it for decades. And George W. Bush wanted Canada to participate in the existing ballistic missile defense system, the limited, twitchy, unreliable one that the Americans already have. The Canadian government turned him down, said, nah, we're not going to do it. Later on, Canada, as part of NATO, endorsed the idea of ballistic missile defense for NATO. So we ended up being in this absurd situation where Canada was on the record supporting ballistic missile defenses for everybody except Canadians. So signing up with the program makes sense. It will resolve the bizarre situation where the Canadian government policy is that Americans should have ballistic missile defenses, our European allies should have ballistic missile defenses, but we will not participate in ballistic missile defenses for Canada. That was dumb, and we should resolve that. But we're still really getting into issues here where a lot of people are asking very legitimate questions of the Prime Minister of, so are we under a threat of annexation or not? Are we elbows up? Are we elbows down? Are we standing up for the country or are we not? And I know the Prime Minister's already responded to this, where he said cooperation if necessary, but not necessarily cooperation. Okay, he's channeling WLMK. That's great. That's good. You always, who said conscription necessary, but not? I think it was Mackenzie King. Might have just embarrassed myself. I think it was Mackenzie King, but the expression was conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. And now okay, but we just have the most important of our lives, election of our lives, and that was, just looking at my watch here, like 3.5 weeks ago. Has Mike Myers been consulted on Golden Dome? Have we polled boomers who own homes about whether they think we should have anti-drone defenses over our ports and airfields? I have questions, Jen, and I don't have answers for them.
Well, I'm sure those answers will be forthcoming.
No, I'm not. I'm not at all.
That was sarcasm, Matt.
The funny thing is too, like talking like things coming up. One of the other things, and I'm not even sure you saw it this morning before we got it started rolling. The White House has confirmed that the president intends to attend the G7 in, where the hell is it? Is it Alberta? Are you guys hosting? Is it Alberta or BC? It's somewhere out west. Kananaskis or Blink Blink Bueller? Okay,
yeah.
It's in Canada.
Yeah, it's Canada. Okay, sorry. Our feed just froze there, so I missed the last about 45 seconds of what you just said.
You know what?
I just heard the set out of nowhere. It just said, you said Kananaskis.
Okay, G7. The upcoming G7. Is that in Alberta?
Literally that way. It's over there.
So the president has said he will attend, and I don't think there was a lot of doubt about that, but there was some. So just think about Mark Carney, okay? In the immediate agenda, you've got the king coming, you've got the post office maybe shutting down. You've got to decide whether we're elbows up or elbows down with anti-drone defenses. You've got the president coming to a G7, and the last time we hosted it, you might remember it didn't go well. And on top of all of this, he doesn't have a permanent chief of staff. The PMO is under strength. Marco Mendicino is currently basically the point man for His Royal Highness and Donald Trump visiting, and whether or not our cities should be protected from ballistic missile attack, and whether or not I'm going to be able to send mail.
I see no problems here, Matt. Everything will be fine. Mark Carney's on it. Look, on that note, we want to talk about why we think murder is bad. We will talk about that when we get back. But first, I think we should put a pin in it. Like and subscribe. Check us out at www.readtheline.
It's going to be hard to talk about this because it's a serious topic. It's a heartbreaking topic, but it makes me angry. And when I get angry, I get sarcastic, and I don't want to be an asshole.
Okay.
This week in Washington, a couple of young Israelis were leaving an event that was, I've seen it described differently. I've seen it described as either an embassy facility for the Israeli embassy or a Jewish cultural facility where an embassy event was being held. In any case, they were killed. They were shot down. And the individual who shot them was immediately arrested. He was filmed afterward chanting "Free Palestine." And the individual was, because Americans are good at this sort of thing, we're not. The individual was rapidly identified and had a long
rap sheet.
Not rap sheet, but was a known political activist with membership or alignment with far left causes.
Sure.
Which are now disowning him.
Well, good. I mean, good.
You and I have talked about the fighting in Israel a lot, and fighting in Gaza, in the Middle East, a lot.
Less often lately. Canadian politics more or less took up the bulk of the room, which is appropriate. Like I said, we're not a Middle Eastern
we dip in and out when necessary
news blog, but and I also would like to say I think that we try to focus when we do talk about Middle Eastern stuff, we're trying to focus our attention not on the inner
what's happening at home.
We're talking about what's happening at home and how it's being affected by what is happening in the Middle East. I don't think that we're particularly well qualified to talk about the inner dynamics of the Knesset. And I don't think we're not on the ground, so we're not particularly well qualified to adjudicate the morality of how the IDF is waging this war. Like, we don't have the kind of firsthand knowledge required to judge a lot of that stuff. I mean, we're generally informed, but we're only generally informed. So we try to focus our attention whenever possible, whenever we talk about this stuff, we're talking about how Canadian politics and Canadian culture is affected by what's happening abroad, as opposed to being, North American commentator 488th to weigh in on the latest
Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is there's ample resources for you, the listener, to be pursuing if that's what you're looking for. So we try to speak, if we talk about what's happening in Israel and Gaza, we're talking about it in broad generalities, or we're talking about like the Canadian context here.
When these two Israelis, one was Jewish, one was actually Christian, but I believe an Israeli citizen, when they were killed. And again, this is where I don't want to sound like an asshole, like I'm making light of it, because I'm not blind to the tragedy of these two human beings having been killed. But I was just immediately thinking to myself, someone is going to fuck this up on Twitter. And it's kind of maybe an instinct. It just gets honed with years in the news. But there have been times when I've just heard like the voice of God whispering in my ear, don't tweet something stupid about this. Don't tweet.
How about just don't tweet?
Don't tweet.
Just don't tweet.
And as is predictable,
somebody tweeted? Does somebody tweet?
Oh, I mean, a series of people tweeted. But the one who seems to have had the honest misfortune, I would say, of being the bad guy du jour was a student, and 3.5 weeks ago, a Green Party candidate, a student at Mount Royal University. Ran for the Greens in Calgary Center, got 300 some odd votes.
That's actually not bad.
You want me to redo the tweet?
Okay. Do I want you to read me the tweet?
I mean, probably not, but also YOLO, right? I'm just pulling it up here. This is scintillating. Everybody gets to listen to me type. I have the other tweet I want to read, but I didn't get this tweet. So this was the young man, Jaden Baldonado. There was a CTV News story that simply said 2 staff members of Israeli embassy killed in shooting near Jewish museum in D.C. And the young man retweeted that and added the comment, 100% justified. Just like Luigi and Rodney Hinton, peaceful protest has failed, and the people need to start fighting back against those in positions of power. So I've read the preliminary.
Hamas has taken that to heart.
Yeah. So one of the bits of info coming from witnesses at the scene of the shooting in D.C. was that the shooter had to pause and reload because one of the victims didn't die right away and was still showing signs of life. And that the shooter, having reloaded, fired numerous additional times into the victim, thus killing her. And there's a guy in Calgary who a couple of weeks ago was running for the Greens, who, and I'm flipping right back to the screen cap here, would define that as fighting back against those in positions of power. You know, the interesting thing is too, and this is always a popular thing to bring up at dinner parties. Because
well, and also let's just roll through the implicit assumptions of that. Sure. Because he's saying that the Jews are in power. So therefore attacking the Jews
Or the Israelis in this particular context. Yeah.
But I mean, really, let's be honest. We're talking about the Jews here.
Uh-huh.
Is therefore justified. Violence against Jewish people in North America is justified as an act of protest to what's happening in Palestine. I want to spell out that statement. I want to spell that out so that everybody understands that that's what we're justifying here. I don't want to be mealy-mouthed and say that this isn't saying what it's saying.
People have been saying, this is, like I said, always a fun thing to bring up at a dinner party. Just throw it out the table for discussion. Flying planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11 was pretty incontrovertibly bad. There's a legal nuance about hitting the Pentagon. It's a military target. Now, hitting it with a plane full of civilians sort of settles that issue. But
peaceful protest wasn't working that.
The issue is, if someone wants to go out there and argue that we would never target the Jewish people, we would never target Israeli civilians, but Israeli government targets are valid. The problem, even that argument, which I don't buy, by the way, but even that argument fails here because the police in D.C. have said that the event where the shooting occurred was not a specifically embassy event. And that the shooter apparently undertook, or the alleged shooter, pardon me, got to observe those legal niceties. Apparently, the alleged shooter made no particular effort to ascertain whether the victims were members of the diplomatic staff at the embassy. So it's possible, if these police reports are true, and I want to caution that, we don't know fully yet here, that this could have been a couple of catering staff walking out of the event, getting gunned down. Mm-hmm. And what just strikes me as remarkable here is that there are certain moral bars that should not be difficult to clear. I support Israel's campaign to defeat Hamas. I believe Israel goes too far and has been cavalier about bombing targets with high levels of collateral damage. And I don't know to what extent Israel is responsible for the lack of supplies in Gaza. I remind everybody that Gaza has a border with Egypt too, and Egypt is a non-combatant here, so I kind of wonder what the Egyptians doing. But if someone wants to make the case that Israel is illegally impeding supplies, I have an open mind to that, and we should talk about it. And also, I think I speak for Jen and I both here, we're not Netanyahu fans. We're not at all. And we can have these discussions. We can say these things. But I think we have to be able to have a very low bar, and I'm inviting everybody to join us in clearing it. Don't shoot people as they leave Jewish cultural centers in North America. I think we could probably do better than that, but can we at least go that far?
I think that also we can probably draw a moral distinction between, someone who is in uniform, a Hamas fighter or terrorist in Gaza, embedded in active combat, shooting at an IDF soldier who was also in combat. We're engaging with rules of war here at that point, right? That is a categorically different conversation than saying every Jew or Jewish adjacent person in a totally different country, thousands of kilometers away, is a justified target. That's not engaging in war at that point. Now you're a terrorist. You've embraced the logic of terrorism at that point.
Well,
and you're treating terrorism as a legitimate act of protest.
I want to go back.
That's I think that is a bar that is unacceptable to cross.
I want to quote Mr. Baldonado again. Peaceful protest has failed, and the people need to start fighting back against those in positions of power.
Who's the people? Who are the positions of power? What peaceful protest? What does peaceful protest failing here mean here? Like, there are just so many ways that we need to deconstruct every single sentence or every single word in that sentence to understand what he's actually trying to say here. Right? Like, peaceful protest has failed at what? Who's the person in power here? Who's the person not in power? Is the person in power the innocent Christian Zionist and his soon-to-be fiancé who walked out of a Jewish cultural event in Washington, D.C.? A guy, by the way, who was quite young and worked as a junior embassy staff member and was a big advocate of peace. Was that the person in power, or was it the person in power, the guy who was pumping his gun into him? Who had the power in that situation? I mean, there's just, can we... Now, Matt, I do want to sit here and have another conversation, and that is, I don't think that we should be defining our ideological opponents by the most extremist elements within Twitter. This kid was probably just a stupid kid from Mount Royal University who popped off and said a really stupid
and
thing.
Fucked up his life.
Oh,
yeah. He's deleting all those accounts.
And I think that if you and I were to sit down with this kid and have this conversation with him one-on-one, he'd pretty quickly back down. And my suspicion is he'd pretty quickly be like, yeah, I wasn't meaning to necessarily give aid to the ideas of terrorism. That really wasn't what I was trying to go for. What I was trying to go for was demonstrating support for the armed conflict of the Palestinian people, not Hamas. Like he'd probably give us some kind of mealy-mouthed answer like that, because he's just popping off without necessarily thinking through the things that he's saying and the implications of the things that he's saying. So I don't necessarily want to fall into the trap of saying, look, all the left are like this, because I don't think they are. I don't want to fall into the trap of saying everybody who supports Palestine is really implicitly supporting this guy's position, because I don't think that's true either. And I don't want to fall into the trap of assuming that because there's one main character on Twitter that this is representative of an entire viewpoint. I don't think it is. And I think that if you were to actually challenge this guy face to face, he'd probably cave on a couple of these assumptions that he's made without realizing it.
Today, I think he'd probably cave instantaneously, because I suspect he's having the worst day of his life. You're not wrong. But what I did think about when I saw this was something I read not long after the October 7th attacks by a very smart commentator, occasionally provocative, by the name of Jen Gerson, who wrote that this is a mask off moment. And I agree
for a lot of people on the left, yeah.
Yeah. And I agree with you, not the left writ large. I get it. I agree with that.
We're talking about some of the most extremist subsections of quote unquote the left. That had the effect of using their minority positions and strong activists to, I think, sort of try to rewrite the rules of liberal democracies in their institutions.
I think, though, we're also talking about a larger group that has enabled and tolerated.
That's right. I think that's the better way of putting it. That's correct.
And in a weird way, like one of the first things I said right after October 7th, and I have largely stuck to this, is that I wasn't going to debate. People will come at me online or an email, and I'm not going to debate. It's you and me. Sorry, not you, Jen Gerson, but like speaking through the camera here. Whoever is listening or hearing me right now, there is no Twitter exchange we're going to have that is going to meaningfully improve the lives of Gazans or Israelis. And I'm just skipping that. Yeah. I am choosing not to indulge in that. But what I believe and what I am comfortable with being done to me reciprocally is that I will accept you at face value. When you declare what your thoughts and sympathies are here, I will accept them. And a couple of days ago, we were talking about the trials and the tribulations of Mark Carney. Canada, the United Kingdom, and France put out a joint communique about Israel's renewed offensive in Gaza and threatened unspecified consequences if Israel didn't back down. We talked about it in our last dispatch because it was, even by the standards of international joint communiques, it was hilariously mealy-mouthed. It was, Israel's bad. It's doing bad things. The hostages must be released. Merci beaucoup. Like it was a bad statement by the standards of these things. And I didn't think Carney was putting his best foot forward when that was sort of his first big foray into the Middle East. But Hamas immediately thanked Canada, Britain, and France for their statement. And I'm not going to go on a tirade dunking on Carney going, terrorists are on your side, blah, blah, blah. Hamas is playing the info game too, and I don't see any reason for us to be idiots.
Yeah.
But what I think, and I want to read it to you, after the shooting of these young people in DC, Prime Minister Carney had a couple of statements. I'm going to read them to you. I am devastated and appalled by the murder of 2 young Israeli embassy staff in Washington, D.C. This was a targeted attack against the Jewish community, a violent act of anti-Semitism. This hate is intolerable, and I condemn it in the strongest terms. My prayers are with Yaron and Sarah, their grieving loved ones, and the entire Jewish community. We cannot look away from the power of anti-Semitism and its radicalization. We must act to keep Jewish Canadians safe. To that end, Canada's new government will fight the horrifying rise in hate and protect our communities. We'll increase funding to the Canada Community Security Program and introduce legislation to make it a criminal offense to intentionally and willfully obstruct access to any place of worship, schools, and community centers, and a criminal offense to willfully intimidate or threaten those attending services at those locations. So that's the Prime Minister's statement.
I have no problem with that statement.
It's fine.
It's fine.
Remember what I was saying to you in the first segment about how we just keep adding layers and layers of process?
Mm-hmm. Oh, we just added another layer of process?
Canadian police, like most of what's been happening in these pro-Palestinian marches or anti-Israel or anti-Semitic marches, whatever, people can go fight in the comments about what they think we should call it. But there has been illegal activity in these protests almost since the beginning, or literally since the beginning. Yes. Canadian police have all the authority they need to do something. Canadian courts have all the authority they need to do something. But they're not. But now Canada's new government is going to roll out new legislation. And every MP, Liberal MP, in a riding with a heavily Jewish population has a new set of talking points, can be ripped right off that tweet by the Prime Minister. Every time a cabinet minister or the Prime Minister himself is doing the Sunday morning shows or is at a community event for the Jewish community, they've got new talking points here. My son plays hockey at a hockey rink in the West End of Toronto, and the most direct way for me to get from my house to it takes me through a heavily Jewish neighborhood. And ever since October 7th, one of the community centers and schools in the area has a big parking lot. It has basically become a full-time command post for a special task force of the Toronto Police to protect local Jewish targets. I don't have a solution to the hostages. I don't have a solution to the Middle East. As unpopular as it is, bomb them until Hamas is destroyed is clearly what Netanyahu has come up with. And I don't like it, but I don't have anything better to offer. I have yet to come up with a superior solution that I think will have any chance of success. And I'm not going to spend a ton of bandwidth on trying to fix the Middle East. I just don't like driving through my own community and seeing a police command post in the parking lot of a Jewish school.
Yeah, that's the. I would further add to that and say, like, look, everybody in Canada has a right to protest. I agree, I disagree. Doesn't matter what I think about your positions and your protest positions, but you have a right to protest. But you don't have a limitless right to protest. And you don't have a limitless right to say whatever the hell you want. There's a point at which what you're saying goes from being protest and into threat. And there's a point at which protest goes from being protest and into intimidation. And there's a point from which intimidation goes from being intimidation into being active threat. And to me, I don't think the lines between these two things are often all that blurry. For example, when the protesters took to protesting, like I said, you want to go protest the Israeli embassy? Okay, that strikes me as legitimate. You want to go take your protest to an overpass in a Jewish neighborhood in Toronto? That's not a protest anymore. Now you're engaging in active intimidation. You're trying to scare people. That's what you're trying to do in order to get what you want.
Which is illegal.
Which is illegal. That is illegal. And, our poor Mount Royal kid, who on one hand, I'm just like, you said something really fucking stupid and now we're faffoing here. And on the other hand, I can empathize with him as a stupid kid, as I've also been a stupid kid who said stupid kid things in my 20s. But look, what you're telling here is that there is a subsection of this activist group who are not just against the war in Gaza, or not just trying to protect Gaza children. There's a subsection of this group who has accepted the logic of terrorism. They've accepted the logic of terrorism not in the Middle East, not in Gaza, not in Israel. They've accepted the logic of terrorism and they're applying it here at home, right? Here in Canada, for fuck's sakes. A country that will not dictate the outcome of what happens in the Middle East by any degree. And if you've accepted the logic of terrorism and you're acting upon that acceptance of that logic, then we need to start treating you like terrorists. The state needs to regard you as a terrorist and treat you as such. And are you prepared for that? Because that is going to be the consequences of this logic. We have an obligation and duty to accept and respect protest. We have an obligation and a duty to come down on terrorists like a ton of bricks on a pallet from a third-story window.
Squish.
And like I said, the line there ain't ambiguous. So,
this week, Mike College of Ipsos had an op-ed for us where Ipsos, our friends there, recently did an 8,000 person survey on key issues, like what are actually Canadians worried about. And what was interesting is, as Mike noted in his piece, we just came through an election that everybody seems to agree was the economic threat to Canada, elbows up election. But he actually found those were the tier 2 issues. Canadians care about that. Like Mike says, it like this is a very important issue. But above that, in terms of their own quality of life, one of the ones that Canadians ranked even higher than that was public order and safety. Mm-hmm. And I pulled up when I read Mike's piece, and I guess I could have mentioned this in either of our 2 other segments, but at no time like the present, I guess. I pulled up Mark Carney's the mandate letter that we talked about earlier, because he hasn't issued ministerial mandate letters. He has put out a 7-point plan that all of his ministers are going to be behind. And I wanted to see, after I read Mike's piece, based on the Ipsos data, how much of what Prime Minister Carney said was focused on public safety and public order. One sentence fragment where when the Prime Minister is talking about making Canada stronger, he leads by talking about the armed forces and standing up for our sovereignty, but also increasing public safety by, and I quote, reinforcing the police. Mm-hmm. Look, police forces all over the country will get up my ass when I say this, but I don't think we have a problem right now of police resourcing. I think we do actually have some police resourcing problems, but we have a bigger problem right now. They don't want to do this. And you said a minute ago, come down on them like a pallet of bricks off a 3rd-story window. I'd actually settle for some heavy fines, because I honestly believe the problems we have now is not that we haven't gone in with like guys swinging batons to crack heads. I bet you if from day one we had been assertive about handing out painful fines and publicly identifying some of these people, we would have not avoided all of this, but we would avoid a lot of it.
Well, look, I think
absolutely zero consequences emboldens.
That's right.
The next day's problem.
And I think the consequences should be commensurate with the crime. Okay, like I think that trying to engage in public intimidation is probably a finable offense. It's not a jailable offense, but I think that should be a finable offense. If you're trying to harass people coming out of the Jewish daycare center, that should probably be a finable offense at this point. I'm okay with that. I don't think that falls within the rubric of free speech or protest. I think that you've crossed a line there. So like there are judgment calls here. But if you're getting up in front of a crowd of thousands of people and advocating violence against the Jews, if you're going up into Twitter and saying the murder of these completely innocent Israeli citizens is justified, you're crossing lines here into intimidation and criminal harassment. And if we don't have a police force that's willing to, I said, I don't want to get into broken windows theory per se, but like the more when you tolerate the small stuff escalates, and that's what we're starting to see.
Our friend of the line, Paul Wells, has done some really interesting reporting on this. He's spoken to experts in modern law enforcement theory. He's talked a little bit. And Paul, I'm sorry here. I'm taking some incredibly long articles he wrote and I'm bastardizing them down into like 2 sentences. But law enforcement in this country was scarred by the aftermath of the G20 in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And around the same time, we also had in Ontario, it was a few years before that, we had the standoff between Indigenous land protesters and the Ontario government in Caledonia.
Mm-hmm.
And the combined effect of those things, plus a few others, has been the police kind of getting it knocked into their heads that we don't want to be handsy. Mm. It is career limiting to be aggressive. So police, almost out of a matter of professional self-interest, we were talking a minute ago about all these layers of process that the politicians use as heat shields against criticism and controversy. You want to know another thing that can get used as a heat shield between politicians and an angry public? The police. And the police ain't volunteering for that. Mm-hmm. So we've got ourselves in a situation right now where the police have adopted the attitude, and I've written about this before, we're here to keep the peace. No, you're not. That's actually not your job. In a very fundamental way, the job of the police is not to keep the peace. It's to enforce the law. The peace is downstream of that. Mm-hmm. If you, as police officers or police commanders, for any who might be listening, if you think your job is to keep the peace, you're doing your job wrong. Enforce the law and you will have peace. Try to have peace without the law, you will not have peace. So we have a police problem for this. We have a court problem. Nothing we need to get into at length here. We've talked about it at length.
Well, but
we bail out everybody. We can't convict everybody.
There's also but the other side of that is that group dynamics are hard, and we don't necessarily want police engaging in escalatory dynamics because that leads to riots that could otherwise be diffused by just talking someone down.
I think we're in a point now where what we're finding is the riots aren't being diffused. They're just being postponed and then resumed.
But there haven't been riots.
No, fair enough. But in order to avoid the riot, we're tolerating sustained lawlessness, where no one wants to do the thing that would end the sustained lawlessness because they're afraid of triggering a riot. So they have avoided successfully, thumbs up, a riot. And in exchange, they have gotten a year and a half of lawless protests.
And also in exchange, they've also put a minority group into sustained pressure and stress and terror.
That is the cost of avoiding the riot here. I don't like riots. I don't want to see people get their heads smacked in. But I think we need to establish here that avoiding the riots has not been zero cost. Yeah. And the people who've been bearing the cost are Jewish Canadians. So we got police who are just trying to keep the peace, even though it's not their job. We got courts that even if the police went out and arrested a bunch of these guys, would be immediately releasing them all on bail. We've got a government that will respond to all of this by just issuing more and more layers of process and introducing new bits of legislation. I understand why some of my Jewish friends, and I'm not speaking in the abstract, I'm speaking of real human beings. I understand why they're arming up. The government has sent a pretty clear signal to them. And a couple of nice tweets by the Prime Minister, you know what they're worth? A couple of nice tweets.
I mean, it's not just the Jewish community that's arming up. There are entire sections of the country now that have become or feel more violent than they used to be. And people are scared in a way that I've never seen them be scared in this country before.
You don't have to be Jewish to see what's happened to Canadian Jews.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm just suggesting maybe let's start with some fines. Could we just fine some people? Would that be reasonable? You know
what? I think I'm with you, but also name them.
Yeah.
And I don't think, and I don't want to. I want to say this very carefully because I don't want to be accused of doing something I'm not. I don't think this is an immigrant or foreigner-driven problem. I don't think it is. I think this is an at-home problem.
Well, and also, like I said, I don't want to fall into the trap of being like, every single one of these protests is a lawless catastrophe, because I don't think that's true. And I also happen to think that most of the people who are showing up to these sort of pro-Palestinian protests are not motivated by the logic of terrorism. Mm-hmm. Most of them are showing up because they have real compassion for the people of Gaza and would like
of terrorism. They're demonstrating legally within a civic society.
and I want to make it really clear here. We're not talking about those people. We're not. We're talking about the minority that exists within some of these protests that cross the line.
Use those people as human shields and cover.
That's right. And who cross the line. And I think that we need to start being willing to state that there's a distinction between these groups here.
Unfortunately, and this is as true as problems on the right as it is the left, which is why Jen and I are very popular. Fundamentally, you've always got to clean up your own house. No house ever gets successfully cleaned by the other side. There has been an unwillingness to do this. There has been a failure to do this. The left has indulged their crazies, and so has the right. Mm-hmm. But now, layered onto that, we've got police that don't want to police, courts that don't or can't court, and politicians who sure as hell don't want to lead. And who ends up paying for this? The Jews.
Well, the Jews historically have always paid for this sort of scenario, yes.
History is now.
Yeah. Anyway,
sorry, guys.
I have nothing else to add to that.
No, me neither. Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Like and subscribe, www.readtheline.ca. Take good care of yourselves, and may we do better in the future. Have a good weekend. No, we won't.